Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is the weekly teaching. Let's see, it's Saturday, April the 9th, 2016. And today, I want to talk to you about glory. Of course, we're reading through the Old Testament with Jesus in mind, and or during the daily podcast, a chapter a day. And so I've been using this weekly teaching to summarize that, but then in other cases just to talk about broader subjects. Last week was sort of a different subject, but the theme through all of this is to understand Jesus, what his coming means to the world, the Creator becoming one of us and living among us, and allowing us to treat him as we would, and then rising from the dead and reclaiming all of creation. Is just a wonderful story. It's a wonderful set of facts. And today I specifically want to talk about glory. And to do that, I want to use an Old Testament text. This is from the book of Haggai. And this is Haggai chapter 2 and verse 9. Haggai is a real little book. 2 chapters is all. And it's one of the 12 prophets. It sits at the end of the Old Testament, where you've got Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. 12 writings. They're all relatively short, and Haggai is one of the shortest of them. They're called the minor prophets, not because these prophets were less important than, say, Isaiah or Jeremiah, but simply because their writings are shorter. So sometimes they're called the minor prophets or the 12. And it's interesting that there were 12 of them, just like there were 12 apostles. But Haggai is one of these prophets. And Haggai lived at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when Jerusalem was being restored. Of course, the arc of history in the Old Testament, at least insofar as the nation Israel is concerned, is that Moses leads them out of slavery in Egypt. They become a nation. They enter the promised land. They go through the times of the judges, which were, not very good times. It was the time when there was no king in Israel and every person did right in his own eyes. And then Hannah gives birth to Samuel. He becomes a priest, and Samuel is used by God first to anoint Saul as king of Israel, and then when Saul fails, he picks David. And then David, through a succession of military endeavors, consolidates the kingdom, defeats all of Israel's enemies, and then turns over to his son, his heir Solomon, this great and mighty nation. And from that point on, Israel gradually descended into, they were eventually defeated. They're eventually defeated by Babylon. They had good kings and they had bad kings, but they had more bad ones than good ones. One of the first things that happened was the kingdom split. It's one of the reasons why Jesus said a house divided against itself cannot stand. And their behavior, their lack of faithfulness to the covenant that God had given them through Moses was what caused their decline. They didn't keep the law. They didn't keep the Torah. That was the Jewish word for law. Torah is a word that really, more than law, it really means teaching or instruction. So the law of Moses is the teaching of Moses, the instruction of Moses, which is the teaching or the instruction of the Lord. And finally, Israel became so disobedient, their behavior became just like the behavior of the Canaanites before them, that just as God had to wipe the Canaanites off the land, he had to wipe the Israelites off the land in order to be just, because God is not partial. He wasn't showing partiality to Israel. He was giving them a law, and they needed to keep it, and when they didn't, they were punished for it. They were driven off the land, conquered by Babylon, and their descendants were scattered throughout the earth. Well, some of them came back to Israel to rebuild the temple. That included Ezra and Nehemiah, and Haggai was a prophet among them. And so at that time, they were rebuilding the temple, trying to restore Israel, but, they were under King Cyrus, who had issued the decree for them to come back. So it wasn't like Israel was, the great and mighty nation again. So they wondered, okay, God, is this the restoration that you promised? And it wasn't, because there was a much greater restoration promised. It says here in Haggai chapter 2 and verse 9, the prophet Haggai is speaking, and he's speaking on behalf of the Lord. And he says, "The latter glory of this house will be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I shall give peace, declares the Lord of hosts." So the promise was that the latter glory of this house would be greater than the former. The later glory would be greater than the earlier glory. So when we get, and this would have been around 300-400 BC. So when we get to the first century AD, then we're in the time of the Gospels, and we can see the disciples following Jesus. They believed he was a prophet. Some of you even believed that he was the Messiah of Israel, so they were ready to follow him. And that's why James and John, the sons of Zebedee, went to him and said, "When you sit in your glory, can we sit on your right hand and your left? When you sit in your glory." So they expected him to reign as king over Israel, just like David had and just like Solomon had, because the promises of God for the Messiah were that the descendant of David would inherit David's throne. Now, added to that, you can see that Haggai here is saying that the latter glory will be greater than the former glory. So the expectation among those Jews, James, John, and all the others, the expectation was, and by the way, this would have been among all Jews, that the latter glory, the glory to come in the future, would be greater than the glory in the past. So, if anything, they believed that the Messiah's glory was going to be even greater than David's or Solomon's had been. Now, that's a lot of glory, because remember, in the days of Solomon, the Queen of Sheba was a queen of another nation, and she heard about Solomon's glory, and she came to see it for herself, if it was as great as she had heard. And when she got there and she observed it all, she said, "The half was not told me." There was no exaggeration to it. So you can see specifically why James and John and the other of Jesus' disciples fully expected his kingdom to be even greater than all that they'd heard from their ancestors about David and Solomon's kingdom. And thus, why they were so utterly shocked when he was crucified. I mean, they couldn't believe it. Now, he had told them before he died that he was going to die and be raised from the dead, but they just didn't nobody knew what resurrection from the dead meant, because no one had ever been raised from the dead. People had been brought back from the dead occasionally. Elijah, Elisha, Jesus himself bring back someone from the dead, but they always died again. So when Jesus said, "Well, I'm going to die and rise again," they didn't think of that in terms of anything eternal. They didn't know what to make of it. And when he died on the cross, and he was really dead and they buried him, they didn't really see, who was going to bring him back? Elijah and Elisha brought people back from the dead, and Jesus brought people back from the dead, but who was going to bring Jesus back from the dead? There was nobody that had that kind of spiritual power in Israel, because he was the greatest one. So they were just completely devastated when he died, and it really looked like a promise like this really missed the mark. Because it says, "The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I shall give peace." No, they didn't have anything anywhere approaching that. But once Jesus was raised from the dead, spent 40 days among them, eating with them, walking with them, doing all sorts of different things, meeting with different groups of people so that everybody could be assured that he really was alive, that this just wasn't some isolated experience, that someone had a vision or a dream or a hallucination or something. He proved to them by many convincing proofs, it says in the first chapter of Acts, that he was raised from the dead. And then he ascended into heaven to sit at the right hand of God. They saw all of a sudden greater glory took on a different meaning, because they had been thinking of glory, the greater glory being greater in degree, greater in magnitude. But what God had in mind was something that was, yes, greater in degree, but more importantly, greater in kind. A greater kind of glory. You say, well, what greater kind? How do you mean greater kind of glory? Well, it was a spiritual glory and not a physical glory. An example, in the Old Testament, David took a slingshot and a stone and struck Goliath, and Goliath fell. Well, there was glory associated with that. That was glory for Israel. Israel was defeating its enemies. But in the New Testament, Jesus didn't lift a finger. And in fact, he turned the other cheek when evil came his way. He walked the extra mile. He gave everything he had. He said, if someone asks for your coat, give him your shirt also. Well, they stripped Jesus clean when he died. You see, the greater glory that's in the New Testament is the glory that Jesus demonstrated. I mean, it's one thing to have the glory of the Old Testament. You win battles, you got an entourage, you got a crown, you got a scepter, you got a nice seat, a throne, you've got a royal court, you've got all these advisors, you've got people worshiping you. That's a certain kind of glory. That's the kind of glory of the Old Testament. Glory according to the flesh, glory according to the eyes, what the eyes can see. The glory of the world. But in the New Testament, it's a spiritual glory, the glory of God. The glory of doing what Jesus did and then acting like Jesus acted. It was glorious, but glorious in a very different way than they'd ever been used to. Because if you think about all the good that Jesus did, he healed the sick, he fed the hungry, he gave to the poor, he encouraged the weak. And what was he given in return for all that? He was slapped, he was mocked, he was spit upon, he was nailed to a cross, he was tortured, and he was brutally killed. And he never lashed out at the people who were doing this to him. He did not take revenge. He turned the other cheek. That's what his life was turning. He did all this good. See, most people in the earth, when they do good things, there's rewards for that. People appreciate it. Maybe not everybody, but enough people appreciate it. People thank you. People honor you. You do good things in life, you usually get noticed for it. But what was so remarkable about the life of Jesus of Nazareth, when you read in the Gospels, was when has anyone ever done that much good and got rewarded so poorly for it? So poorly. I mean, when you compare the treatment, the response he deserved from humanity to the response he got, you're really hard pressed to find any other life like it. I've never been able to find any other life like it. I mean, you can find lives where people do good things, but I can't find a life where anyone did as much good as Jesus for as many people. I mean, for one thing, the power of God was not working through any other human being as strongly as it was through him. So I can find other people who've lived exemplary lives, maybe Mother Teresa or Francis of Assisi, or, there's certain other people that have lived exemplary lives, but who's lived a life quite like Jesus that actually did as much good as he did for people? I mean, blind people could see. People that had been blind from birth could see. People that had been lame could walk. People that had leprosy would be cleansed and walk around with normal people. I mean, there's just no life like it. And then on the other hand, in terms of suffering, you can find people who've suffered. There's terrible suffering in this world. You can find people that have been mistreated, people innocent that don't deserve what happens to them. You can find that. But to find in one life, one and the same life, that much good done and that much evil in response, there's really nothing like it. And it's only if you've tried to live and do the right thing in life that you can really begin to appreciate what Jesus did when he accepted his fate, when he accepted the terrible lack of appreciation that he encountered. Because most of us, had tried at different times to do life, and if we don't get appreciated for what we do, we get pretty disgusted with that. And pretty soon we run out of gas. It's not worth it if we're not going to be appreciated. It's hard. It's hard enough to do the right thing in life, but then to do the right thing when nobody's appreciating it is even harder. And then to do the right thing, not be appreciated, and even be hated for it. Bitterly hated and rejected by your own people. But then respond in the way that Jesus did. That's glory of a different kind. That's not earthly glory. That's not being the President of the United States or the Queen of England and having all the pomp and circumstance, having Hail to the Chief played every time you walk in a room, or God Save the Queen, or whatever it happens to be. This was greater glory than any earthly glory could ever be. So because of Jesus, we can see the truth of this promise. The latter glory of this house will be greater than the former. And this greater glory played out not only in the life of Jesus, but then continued in the life of his apostles that we read about in the book of Acts and in the epistles. And they began behaving the same way he did. Paul was beaten and put in prison. Peter was put in prison and beaten. And yet they continued to preach the good news and do these mighty works of God. The Holy Spirit was working through them and miracles were taking place. And so the life of Jesus was replicated. The glory was magnified because that superior glory of doing a kindness and in spite of, in the face of evil, was multiplied. So throughout the New Testament, yes, we do see greater glory. The greater glory that God had prophesied through Haggai is seen. There's greater glory in the New Testament than there is in the Old Testament, but it's glory of a different kind. It's a greater kind of glory, not just a greater degree of glory. So in the Old Testament, David and Solomon, they had their horses, they had their generals, they had their temple, they had their own house, they had gold, they had silver, they had all these things that are the stuff of earthly kingdoms. But they didn't have the kind of glory that Peter and Paul and Stephen and the others had. So God came to teach us his ways, to teach us about himself. And that means teaching us what he values, what he considers glorious. He's not impressed with a stadium full of people. He's not impressed with how many Twitter followers we have, or how many likes we get on Facebook, or how many friends we have, whether it's real life friends or social media friends. That stuff just doesn't mean anything to him. What means something to him is goodness, righteousness, justice, truth, honesty, character, integrity, These are the things that matter to him. And when those characteristics are displayed in the face of hostility, not only of lack of appreciation, but in the face of outright hostility, then the glory of those characteristics is even greater. If you can be good when the people you're being good to don't deserve you to be good to them, that is greater glory. That's the glory of God, because that's what God has done with us. He came and died for sinners. We were sinners. We were ignoring him. We have had periods of our life where we're not only ignoring him, we're doing everything we can to satisfy our own desires and pleasures. But he loved us anyway. He reaches out to us anyway. Think of what glory that is. This is why the Apostle John could say in the New Testament, if you can bear with me a second here. I'm looking for the verse that says, here it is, verse 14 in John chapter 1. John says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. He dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. See, John is not talking about the glory he had once he went to heaven. He's talking about the glory he had on earth. And he says, we beheld his glory. We saw it. And what's glory is he talking about? He's talking about the greater glory that Haggai had prophesied. And he's saying, we saw it. We saw him turn the other cheek. We saw him walk the extra mile. We saw him give his coat and his shirt. We saw him give everything he had until the end. He gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give. So when and if you hear people talk about this prophecy from Haggai, the latter glory of this house will be greater than the former, and use it to talk about some future physical coming of Jesus, and they're just still caught in a fleshly mindset, in a physical mindset. They're still wrapped up in a fleshly worldview. Their minds have not been opened to see the greater glory of God's ways. God doesn't care if we have silver or gold. He can produce silver or gold like that anytime he wants it. What he cares about is character, moral excellence, truth, honesty, straightforwardness, uprightness, godliness. These are the things that cannot be manufactured. Sacrifices have to be given. We have to sacrifice our pleasures in order to have these qualities. And that's what Jesus did. And in doing so, he left an example for us to do the same thing. So from now on, whenever you read the scriptures and you think of glory, recognize there's two kinds of glory. There's the earthly glory, and everybody knows what that is. Everybody in the earth is looking for glory. They're looking for celebrity. They're looking for fame, for power. They're looking for glory. But it's an earthly glory. You, whenever you hear about it, recognize there's a greater glory. There's a greater glory. And it's the glory of God, and it's the glory of his nature, his character. God is love. God is love. And he wants you to be loved too. And true love is always good, even in the face of evil. That's the greater glory that you and I are to remember. And whenever we read about glory in the scriptures, that's the glory we're to seek. We're not to seek the praise of people. We're to seek the praise that comes from God when we do the right thing. And especially when we do the right thing when there's no earthly reason to do it. We do it because it's the right thing from heaven's point of view. So let's go out and seek his glory today and every day. God bless.